Okay, so we are here today with Mr. Edward Davies, who around these parts is more commonly known as Mr. Louisa Davies. He is the Director of Policy for the Centre of Social Justice, known as the CSJ, and he and I are going to have a little bit of a chat about the church and whether it can be involved in reshaping the future. But before we do that, Ed, quick intro. Who are you?
I think, as you said, I'm Mr. Louisa Davies, and that's mostly all you need to know. I work for a think tank, which is a weird Westminster thing where we do research and lobbying on policy to the government. My particular think tank focuses on root causes of poverty, so we look at different areas that government can make a difference in trying to solve poverty.
Very good. Very good. Tell us, it does raise the question of what it's like being a Christian in the world of politics.
That's a great question. It's interesting. There are more Christians in politics than you would think. I think sometimes politics is thought of as a slightly godless place, but actually there are a lot of people there who really care about people. And I think it's very easy to see, particularly MPs, as these kind of slightly grotesque, terrible people who say awful things on our television screens. But I'd say there are a lot of really good people, not just Christians, lots of Christians, but a lot of really good people trying to do good things. And in some ways, I've found it easier being a Christian in politics than I have done in previous parts of my life when I've worked in healthcare and I've worked in journalism and things like that. In some ways, there are a lot of good people in politics doing good things, Christian or not.
So to our theme then, and the church reshaping the future. Some commentators have said that during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 crisis, the church has been largely absent from national life. Would that be your reflection?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to watch, actually. I think reading the Westminster media, yes, the sort of the church, capital T, capital C, really hasn't played a big role. It's been quite interesting that one of the few big interventions was a group of bishops writing during the Dominic Cummings affair that you're probably familiar with. And regardless of the right or wrongs of that, we won't go into that. But it was interesting. That was one of the only major interventions. So on a big national picture, we haven't seen a great deal of the church during the last few months. But that doesn't necessarily translate to people's experience. So the national conversation and people's experience can be very different. And I think for members of this church, they will know that the church, small t, small c, this church and other churches on the ground have been really active. And so there's a real dissonance between the church and churches on the ground.
Do you feel that for example, the Most Reverend Justin Welby should perhaps have been more vocal over the last 4 months or so than he has been?
It's a really difficult one, and it depends what you want the national conversation to be. But I want to flag up where I think the church has really played its role here. Just to pick a good example, the government rolled out this food voucher program through schools. Not perfect, never is, but they did a reasonable job. They handed out these vouchers to schools. And then the schools gave them to the children can spend them in supermarkets. And about 4 weeks into the lockdown, I was talking to a primary school administrator, not from St Mike's, I'd say, it's from a different school. And they were saying, this is great, we've got the vouchers, we're starting to give them out now. We're not sure how kids are spending them, no, we're not sure if their parents are spending them, we're not quite sure what's going on. And this was about 4 weeks into the lockdown period. So something was happening, it was starting to happen, but there was no detail. But you contrast that with what the church on the ground was doing. I knew that on day one, people from this church were going round houses saying what was needed. And it sort of spoke to what is the role of church in society? Because actually, I think sometimes we think, can the government solve, we've got this crisis, the government needs to step in. And in this case, the government did step in. It wasn't perfect, but they did, and they handed it out. But the role of the church was actually fundamentally important. I mean, actually rolling out a national food voucher program in 4 weeks is amazing. But the church reacts same day because it's got those relationships on the ground. And those relationships are absolutely core. And in terms of what that means in the future as well, we're all experiencing this crisis now, but individuals experience crises in their life every day. So it may be the breakdown of a relationship. It may be a sudden accident, involving a disability or something like that. And the government will do what it can, I'm sure, and it will be imperfect and it will take time because it's serving 65 million people. But because the church has these relationships on the ground, the local church can make a difference the next day. And so it's been a real reflection, I think, in my work that we expect the government to do all this stuff, but frankly, they can't. Whereas what expectation are we putting on ourselves and our church and the people in it, and me, to react to these things?
Is it also a case here that there's a difference between reality and the way that reality is reported? So while the commentariat may be talking about churches being largely absent from national life, there is a lot happening locally. Maybe even there's a lot happening behind the scenes in Westminster, in that the church is perhaps more involved than we see reported in the news. Is the church doing more even at a political level behind the scenes in Westminster than we're seeing?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, I do think at that national top level, the church has not been necessarily involved. But I think, again, that speaks to its strength, is not necessarily in the national conversation. It's in the relationships and lives of real people. What has been, I mean, if you read the Church Times or something like that, you'll notice that there are sort of various arguments going on around things like universal basic income and welfare support and things. And these are all really good things to be talking about. You know, it's what I do for a living. It's important that we get these right. But actually, that's not the USP of the church, in that I can have that conversation with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation or the Children's Society, all these excellent organisations. But the church is fundamentally churches rooted in communities with relationships with real people that they can serve on a day-to-day basis. So that's not to say, just to stress that, you know, I'd be without a job if we say that the national picture isn't important, but that there are other people that do that as well. But what there isn't is small local churches. There's no alternative to that. There's no one else who can do that.
So looking ahead then, if we're thinking about rebooting society and reshaping the way that our society works, what can we be doing here at a local level, at St Mike's, St Stephen's, in Croydon? What can we be doing to help bring about a stronger, fairer society?
It's a great question. I think it's been a really good challenge to me in the last couple of months to think I am pushing. So my organisation, when they saw what was happening as the lockdown happened, we looked at things like how can we change policy on keeping domestic abuse refuges for women open during this time? How can we broaden the definition of a vulnerable child to ensure everyone gets help? But all those things took time. And in the meantime, actually, a lot of the action was happening on the ground, in person, by members of this church. And there's a real challenge going forward. As I said earlier, these crises, this feels like a big crisis now because we're all in it, but these individual crises happen all the time. Every week, somebody in this church will be going through a crisis. And it's a real challenge to say, actually, are we, you, me, everyone in this church, involved in our local community to ensure that while the government might step in 4, 5, 6 weeks' time down the line, are we available tomorrow to the member of the church who might be in real trouble? Have we built those relationships? Like, actually, would we even know if our next door neighbour was in real trouble? And so to ensure that actually going forward you are loving your neighbour, you are salt and light, and that is a political act.
So do you think, let's say in an ideal scenario, we behave, and all local churches around the country behave in that way you've just described. Can you see a future where the church is a much more visible part of the national agenda, both politically and socially?
I think in some ways, if they're a visible part of the political agenda, shouldn't bother us. But we need to be a very visible part of people's lives, because the political agenda will do its thing, and it will provide a welfare system and a health system. It will oversee the education system, these big national systems, the police, things like that. But it will never be an intimate part of people's lives in a way that the church can be, in a way that if you have built relationships, people will feel that. And it's really noticeable. I mean, whether you're a member of a home group or if you're involved in community lunch or all these things, how relationship-based they are, and how because of that you can really respond to need. Whereas when you don't have that relationship on the ground, it's very hard to know how to respond and what's really needed.
We're, of course, talking about national government here versus local action. We do have local government as well. Should local churches be more closely aligned with local government?
That's a really great question. I mean, we're getting involved in devolution and what that looks like now. I suppose I would say that the secret sauce in the recipe is relationship. And there's going to be some local governments who are really good at that. I mean, I can talk a bit about what happened in Wigan. There's a thing called the Wigan deal, where they looked a lot more about relationships between people, and there's sort of lots of politics you can talk about around that. Some local governments do it better than others. But in terms of that fundamental making a difference to people's lives, the secret sauce is always relationships. And we work with a lot of small charities, and it's really interesting that whether they work in working with ex-offenders, or whether they work in addiction recovery, or whether they work in employment, almost all of them would say that the secret sauce is having a close, trusted relationship with the person you're working with, and that actually success is almost impossible without that. And I think, again, that comes back to the state can provide IT systems and sort of baseline resources and things like that, and it should do, and it's important to get that right, but it's never going to be your friend. It's not a family member. It's never going to be that close, trusted relationship that's so important for life change, but the church can do that.
So as we pray as a church, what should we be praying for as we look to reshape society? And more specifically, how can we pray for you in your work?
That's a big question. I mean, this is going to sound slightly trite, but I think so much of this comes back to that really basic, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. But being conscious that, first of all, the church exists to worship God, and that when we do that, the second thing that will probably flow is a love for our neighbor. And I think how that then works out, well, God will use that. But I think the prayer is sort of worship to God and love for each other, and then the outworking of that will come.
Ed, thank you. Good luck. Thank you for all your hard work, sir. I hope you've enjoyed that. Till next time.